Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books. I'm very happy to be joined today by one of our new authors, Régine Michelle Jean-Charles, who is the author of this wonderful new book called Martin Luther King and the Trumpet of Conscience Today. Professor Jean-Charles is the Dean's Professor of Cultural and Social Justice and Director of Africana Studies at Northeastern University. And her book, as the title suggests, takes up from a series of lectures that Martin Luther King delivered in 1967 called the Trumpet of Conscience. And she relates that, or it takes that as a kind of guide to the agenda or the pathways for a struggle for social justice today in relation to various issues of our time. I wonder if you could begin by telling us a little bit about what King's lectures were about and why you chose that as a kind of foundation for talking about the situation we're in today.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you, Robert. I'm grateful to you as an editor and a publisher, and of course to Orbis. This is my first book with Orbis, but obviously they're a leader in books about faith and social justice. So it is quite an honor for me to be on their roster. I came to the Trumpet of Conscience as a result of an invitation to deliver a keynote. It was an MLK breakfast. And, I always say, why is it always breakfast? And it's never lunch or brunch or dinner. It's always an MLK breakfast. And so when I was a professor at Boston College in 2019, I was invited to deliver an MLK breakfast. And I think the theme even for the year was something about the dream. And I said, well, I'm certainly not going to talk about the dream because I get so tired at how often people are talking about the same speeches over and over. And so I said to myself, I really want to use this as an opportunity for myself to dig deeper into some speeches that King has that might not be as well known. And so I actually asked a good friend of mine who's a professor at Georgetown, and I said to her, well, what do you think the least well known of King's speeches is? And she said, oh, definitely the Trumpet of Conscience. And, the Trumpet of Conscience was originally published as a call to conscience. And then it was republished again as the Trumpet of Conscience. But it is a set of lectures that King delivered in 1967. It was the Massey Lectures. It was for the Canadian Broadcast Company. And there were two things that really drew me to it. First of all, this fact that, the Massey Lectures was for the CBC, right, for a Canadian audience, so not a US audience. And they gave him free rein to choose whatever he wanted as the topics. And so I thought to myself, I know for me as a thinker and as a scholar and as a public speaker, if someone says to me, oh, you can choose whatever topic you want, I'm going to choose the topics that are really important to me, right? I'm going to choose the things that are front of mind in the current moment, the things that I'm thinking about, because we know, writing is thinking. And so in this set of speeches, it's five lectures. The title there, so the 5 different chapters are Impasse and Race Relations, Conscience of the Vietnam War, Youth and Social Action, Nonviolence and Social Change, and a Christmas Sermon on Peace, right? So that's the breakdown of the 5 chapters. And so what you'll see there is some of the stances that he really takes time to elaborate his stance on the Vietnam War. He writes a lot about youth, which again, for me is something that I think about a lot, that I was very drawn to. And then in the Christmas Sermon on Peace is this lecture in which he says, not too long after I had started talking about the dream, I started to see it turn into a nightmare, right? So basically what intrigued me about these, so again, I was drawn to them because I hadn't heard much about them. But then as I read them, I thought, wow, this really resonates with so many of the questions that we're taking up with regards to social justice right now and today. I spend a lot of time thinking about youth activism and organizing. And so I was very intrigued by his approach in these speeches.
It is funny the way that, there's a kind of battle over the memory and the appropriation of Dr. King's, legacy playing out right now, with people actually using that language from the I Have a Dream speech as a way to justify suppressing talking about race or slavery or racial injustice in American schools, and you're part of that wave of people who are trying to call attention to the more radical message of King, and those kind of three themes of militarism, economic injustice, and gosh, what am I blanking out here? And
racism, militarism.
Well, I forget racism. Well, one of the very
know,
first one. Sorry.
We always talk about.
But so obviously the the theme that really runs through your book is so much kind of intersectionality, and King was dealing with that before that was kind of a phrase, and so that becomes kind of structure of how you look at these kind of interconnected themes of social justice today.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that there is this battle over the legacy, right? So we all heard about, I think it went viral, Nicole Hannah-Jones recently gave a speech where she's just quoting King directly, and people had no idea, right, that this is what she was doing. And they thought, what is this radical message? And she reminded people that at the time when Martin Luther King was living, he was called a charlatan, he was called a demagogue, he was called a traitor. And so he was not as popular then as he is today. And I think that you're absolutely correct, that people are even using things like combating critical race theory and combating anti-racist efforts by saying things like, well, he dreamt of he had a colorblind vision. And so of course he wouldn't support Black Lives Matter, which is absolutely untrue. Because again, if you read these speeches and the thread through all of King's work is the fundamental dignity and humanity of the Black person, right? And so when we say Black Lives Matter, that's exactly what we're saying. With regards to the intersectionality, I think that was something that was really important for me as a Black feminist scholar, because that's a lens that I take to all of the work that I do. And of course, King is not known for being a feminist, right? King is not known for championing the rights of women or even supporting the leadership of women, right? And that's why we have people like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, who we know, certainly did more of that. But what I wanted to do was take this lens to think through his life was cut abruptly short, right? And there were certainly stances on which we saw that he evolved. And so part of my question was, wow, I wonder if he had lived, how would he have evolved in his thinking about Black feminism, or about, women's rights, or about the role of women within the civil rights movements? And so that was kind of a thing that I wanted to speculate a little bit, because I do think it's important for us to know that, King was flawed, like all of our heroes were flawed, and his gender politics are certainly one area in which he was flawed. And I think that there's some threads that we see, some kernels in there that can certainly align with our view of what an intersectional politics looks like today.
Well, as you show that there are kind of intimations, in the spirit of his work is pointing toward confronting oppression wherever it occurs. And so it's natural to apply that to themes that weren't foremost in his consciousness in his life. Even with Vietnam, that was just the last year of his life that he's really taking on, American militarism and imperialism. So to speak a little bit about the intersectional themes that you kind of focus in or relate his message to today.
Absolutely. So, I always say that this is not a book about Martin Luther King, but rather it's a book that looks at three contemporary social justice movements through the lens of the Trumpet of Conscience. And so by that, I mean, what does it mean to think about our social justice movements today in relation to this particular set of speeches specifically, but also in general, King's vision, right? And so again, when I look at the Black Lives Matter activists and I see how they are in many ways offering a corrective to King's vision by doing things like refusing to have one leader of the movement, right? Refusing to say, oh yes, this is the person that we should look to. The ways that they're championing the LGBTQ community, right? The ways that they're championing this fact that, we know, what happened with King and Bayard Rustin, and how, at that time, it was not considered correct, right? To even have someone who was openly gay to be a part of this to be a face of the movement. Whereas with the Black Lives Matter activists are saying, no, 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 this is for, when we say Black Lives Matter, we say all Black Lives Matter, and that includes Black trans lives and Black queer lives, right? So in many ways, the Black Lives Matter activists are offering a corrective. And I think that they're also, you know, I think they're also continuing the work through their intersectional framework. So again, when we look at King's attention to poverty and the Poor People's Campaign, which is also, to your point, some of the work that he arrived at later, that is an intersectional lens, right? That is someone that is saying, oh, wow, I was so focused on racism, but now I'm also seeing that militarism, materialism, right? Poverty, I'm seeing that this is a global struggle, right? That is someone who had a kind of narrow view that expanded it. And I think that what's so inspiring to me about the Black Lives Matter movement is that they begin with that expansive movement. So when we say Black Lives Matter, we're not only talking about the United States. This is a global vision. When we say Black Lives Matter, we are talking about, you know, class, race, gender, sexuality, right? We're talking about the multiple oppressions that Black people are subject to. Similarly, we could say for prison abolitionists. So again, I skipped to the third chapter, but you know, the prison abolitionists, I think, are also continuing on this thread where when King says he's against militarism, there is nothing more militarized today when we think about the state than this kind of problem of mass crisis, of mass incarceration, right? So this is another way that we see this vision that's being picked up and expanded upon. And so that's what I'm saying when I say, you know, these are threads that we can look at for these three movements. The movements are Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and prison abolition. And those are just the three that I chose because they were personally important to me and they resonate and intersect with so much of my teaching, my academic work, and my activism. But we could have chosen climate change. I could have chosen, you know, food insecurity or housing insecurity, right? There are many, you know, the rampant wars that are happening right now, right? Right now we have this question of, you know, the Ukraine and Russia, and should the US, you know, the US is sending troops there, right? So we could have chosen militarism, but these are the three particular ones that I chose with the hope that other people would also initiate this similar kinds of studies, right? So again, instead of always saying, oh no, King is so different and his vision and his dream is so different from what we see today, where are the areas in which we see the similarities and also the expansion upon the vision?
Well, you began the book by talking about also the context in which you were writing it. And we had this collision of social crises that had so many different dimensions to it. On the one hand, the pandemic, and at the same time, the murder of George Floyd and the uprising around Black Lives Matter there, and the way that these kind of collided literally in the streets, people wearing masks and protesting. They were both a kind of window on what you call the sickness of our society, taking the phrase from Martin Luther King, and that had a kind of a literal kind of a context. But even with the pandemic, it's not just a medical kind of issue. There were social issues to it. There was a race dimension to it, and the inequality of access to resources and the impact of the disease. There's the questions of the global dimensions of it. So it was a kind of a unique context for you to be looking back toward King, but also looking forward.
It absolutely was. I mean, it's so strange because I think, as I said, I wrote this, I wrote a talk in January of 2019. I was then, I wrote this op-ed based on that talk. And it was at that point that someone from Orbis read my op-ed and asked me if I would be interested in writing a book about this. And that was in 2019, right? That was before the pandemic. And I think even when I signed the book contract, it was towards in the summer of 2019. But then I found myself writing, right, in the midst of a pandemic and in the midst of what was unfolding in those months, right? The months of March, April, May, June of 2020. And it was so stark for me. Again, I think for me as a scholar, as a thinker, as an activist, as a parent, as a child of immigrants, I was just experiencing the pandemic and what everyone was now referring to as these twin pandemics, right? I was experiencing them very intensely. And so it only, it of course came through in my writing, and it gave me an opportunity to reflect on that, right? And to think about, as I say in the book, what would Sojourner Truth have said of this moment? What would Martin Luther King have said about this moment? And I think that, this is something that I take very seriously, especially coming from the cultural tradition that I come from as a Haitian American, is that, our ancestors are there watching over us. They are a part of our everyday, right? And so that spirit of our ancestors, for me, is something that I take seriously, and honoring their thinking and their activism, and asking them, literally inviting them to the table to think about, well, how do we wrestle with this moment? When we look at it through your lens or through your vision. So it was hard, but I think it was also very healing and helpful for me, to feel that I had that spirit that was also with me as I was wrestling through what was such a difficult time for all of us, and for many more than others. I mean, when we think about the immeasurable loss of life, the number of lives that we lost in the pandemic, when we think about people in the Black community who were disproportionately affected, I know that, my own children, we talked a lot about what does it mean to be, food insecure or housing insecure, even for a college student, right? For a college student who is in a situation where they don't want to go home, but they were forced to go home, or thinking about it from the perspective of a domestic violence survivor who has to shelter in place with their perpetrator, right? These are things that were all really percolating in my mind. And then I ended up bringing to this book in an unexpected way, because of course, none of us could have expected it.
Mm-hmm. Well, you ended on a inspiring but poignant kind of note, acknowledging your own weariness, how we feel tired. And I think after this pandemic and the last couple of years, everybody's feeling that kind of exhaustion. But you talk about how we are tired and we continue to fight. And here you're talking about King's message from over 50 years ago. And how the issues continue to confront us. But it's not just an intersectional kind of analysis of injustice, but there's also an intersectional dimension to the struggle. And we, perhaps all engage in that or enter into that in one place or another, but it leads and it's connected to a larger kind of hope and a larger commitment going forward.
I think that's absolutely true. I really do love this this quotation by Bryan Stevenson, where he says that hopelessness is the enemy of justice, right? And that he says that because it's true that when you lose hope, then you kind of lose this will to continue to struggle, to continue to fight. And, I use this as a point of caution too, because last month, because of Martin Luther King Day, I gave a lot of talks. I was invited to a lot of places because of the book. And I spoke to a lot of college students. And one of the things that kept coming up was this idea of burnout and fatigue, right? And I tell the students that this fatigue is very real. And it's important that they do take care of themselves, that they do operate within coalitions and collectives, so that they're able to say, you know what, I can't plan this protest, or I can't do this, but somebody else can take that up, right? So I think that this is what King meant by the beloved community also, is that this beloved community that these contemporary activists find themselves in is a community of care, and is a community of mutual respect, but also a community of support that recognizes that the burnout is real, that the fatigue and the exhaustion are real, and that wants to safeguard our mental health, and that wants to safeguard our lives, right? Because we know that, we can even say right now there's a mental health crisis. And we have a number here in Boston. We have a prominent civil rights activist who was only 30 years old who took her life, right? Who died by suicide. And so when we think about what this person was fighting for and what they were up against, and the fact that, this weight that they had on them caused them to die by suicide, it really makes you wonder, like, how are we in communities supporting each other as we do this work, so that that exhaustion does not end up in fatality. It's so important right now. And I think, again, I think about, my students and the young people I know who are just out of college or, in their 30s, that I think that this is really a question that we have to wrestle with because the cost is very real right now.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure speaking to you. And I really urge everyone to read this extremely important and very timely and challenging and inspiring book, Martin Luther King and the Trumpet of Conscience today by Régine Michelle Jean-Charles. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robert. It was a pleasure to speak with you.